Before I ever met the man, before I stepped into the barn where he all but vanished, I knew him only as a rumor, captured in two crooked phone photos of a yellowed page.
The Last Reader, a tale of obsession, illusion, and the library that devoured. I first heard about a man like him on a photograph of a page. Someone had sent me two phone pictures of an old book. Yellow paper, slanting perspective, a wooden table, and a pair of knees at the bottom of the frame. On page 183, the author, a famous Viennese dealer, described a half-mythical Polish count who loved books more than food, and slowly wasted away as his collection grew. On the next page, the story turned macabre. The Count had once lived in a castle, but sold almost everything to buy more books, and finally retired with his volumes to a bare, ramshackle barn where he ate little, saw no one, and spent every waking hour arranging and admiring his treasures. That was the skeleton of the story you sent me. What follows is the flesh I discovered on that skeleton. The life of another count, similar yet not the same. I knew him, spoke with him, sold to him, and once, late in his life, I walked through his barn and saw what he had done. This is the story of Count Henryk Radecki, the man who nearly bankrupted a fortune trying to prove that the whole world is nothing but a misprinted book. The Count walks in. In those days, I kept a small antiquarian shop on a quiet street near the Ringstrasse in Vienna. Outside, tourists took photographs of facades they would later forget inside. I bought and sold things that no one but a handful of lunatics could ever love. Foxed Sanskrit commentaries, worm-eaten Chinese gazetteers, Persian treatises on optics, Japanese woodblock printed poetry anthologies whose pages smelled faintly of sea salt and smoke. On a grey February afternoon, the bell tinkled and a tall, bony man stepped in out of the drizzle. He stood for a moment under the doorframe, as if uncertain whether my shop was real. "Guten Tag," I said. "How can I—" He raised a hand without looking at me. His eyes were moving around the shop in tiny, jerky motions, cataloguing. They were very pale blue, almost colorless, and set deep in a face that might have been handsome if he had ever slept. "I am searching," he said in German, tinged with the flat vowels of Krakow. "Indian, Chinese, Japanese, Persian. Not missionaries, not tourist albums originals. 16th to 19th century. Mystical, philosophical, preferably heterodox." "That," I said, "narrows it down admirably." His lips twitched. "So many people say old Asian book and mean a tea-stained reprint from 1925. May I look?" He moved toward my glass cases like a diver entering cold water. I watched him as he took out a handkerchief, folded it over twice, and only then reached, bare-fingered but deliberate, for the nearest book. A small palm-leaf manuscript from Orissa, lines of cramped Sanskrit running between two red-margin rules. He did not open it. He simply held it near his face and breathed once as if taking in the scent of it. "That one's early 19th century, I said. "A Bhagavad Gita on palm leaf. 1,500 euros. He ignored the price. The ink, lamp black and plant resin. The scratching of the stylus on the leaf. You can still feel the motion of the hand. He smiled faintly. "It is not what I'm looking for." "What are you looking for exactly?" His eyes flicked to me for the first time. Proof. Of what, he did not say. Instead, he moved to the next case, where my Persian and Arabic items lived in a sort of polite war with each other. His hands trembled slightly as he hovered over a Safavid manuscript leaf, gold-speckled blue margins framing 10 lines of flowing nastaliq. I mentioned that similar illuminated folios from 16th century Iran had fetched tens of thousands of pounds at auction. "That is nothing," he murmured. "A single folio from the Shahnameh has been estimated at several million." I raised an eyebrow. "You follow the auctions." He gave a short, dry laugh. "It is my liturgy." He spent 2 hours in the shop without once sitting down. Occasionally he asked to see something, a group of illustrated Kalpasutra leaves from Gujarat, similar to a set I knew had sold online for almost $50,000. A Persian Sufi commentary whose margins had been gnawed by some anonymous rodent with a taste for metaphysics. A thin volume of Japanese woodblock prints, Meiji-era views of the Tokaido Road. But most of the time he simply stood, hands locked behind his back, looking. He did not haggle when he bought. He paid in cash, crisp notes from a long leather wallet. When I offered to wrap his purchases, he shook his head sharply. "No string," he said. "No tape. I carry them. You'll ruin the bindings. If they cannot survive my hands, they do not deserve to follow me." At the door, he hesitated. "I will need more," he said. "Much more. May I leave you a list?" The list, when he handed it to me, ran to 3 pages. Most of the entries were not titles but descriptions, a complete woodblock printed edition of a Japanese Zen text, ideally the Mumonkan or Hekigan Roku, commentaries acceptable but only if pre-Meiji, lithographed Quran or Sufi texts produced in Bombay or Lucknow before 1900, especially ones with marginalia from local mystics, Chinese Buddhist sutras in fine script. If you ever see anything remotely comparable to the Ming Imperial Wisdom Sutras, tell me at once. At the bottom, he had written, in a surprisingly neat italic hand, H. Radecki, Count of Zhokyu, and a phone number with a Polish country code. "Count," I said. "Is that a joke?" "Unfortunately not." He slipped the list back into his coat pocket, then seemed to remember and handed it to me again. "Call me Henryk, or call me the fool who sells land to buy paper, it makes no difference." 2. The Castle of Books. He became a regular. In the rare book trade, regular means something different than in cafes. My normal customers came once or twice a year, bought a single item, and then went away to digest it financially and spiritually. Henryk might appear 3 times in a week, always in the late afternoon, always moving as if he had just walked out of a dream, and wasn't entirely convinced the waking world deserved his attention. He spoke little about himself, but the story came out in scraps. His family had once been wealthy landowners near Lviv, Zhokiev, he said, with the slight shrug of someone used to border changes and renamings. The communists had taken most of it. Post-communist privatization had returned some. There was a castle, a real one with turrets and damp cellars, which his father had kept as a sort of sullen trophy while living in Warsaw. Henryk alone had moved back after 1989. "And you live there alone?" I asked once. "With my housekeeper," he said. "The castle is too large to be entirely haunted by one man. It needs at least 2. The more he bought, the more curious I became. Some of his purchases were expensive even by my standards. A group of late Mughal Persian commentaries on the Quran printed in Lucknow, an 1850s illuminated Sanskrit horoscope manuscript, similar in spirit to one that had fetched several $1,000s in New York. He paid without flinching, even when I quoted prices that would have made a normal customer blanch. I assumed he had other investments, shares in some boring but profitable company, or perhaps a stash of gold his grandfather had hidden before the war. In any case, it was not my job to audit his solvency. It was my job to find him books. What puzzled me was his taste. Most rich collectors I knew were magpies. They wanted big names and obvious trophies. They would salivate over the record-breaking Ming Sutras that had sold in Hong Kong for $30 million, or the Iranian Quran that went for over $7 million at Christie's, but they had no interest in lesser works. Henryk was the opposite. He followed those sales obsessively, yes, but more as a comparative exercise than out of envy. He would call me after an auction, his voice crackling over a bad rural connection. "You saw it?" he'd ask. "The sutras? 30 million for a single extended negation of the world's reality. Imagine paying so much to be told that everything you own is illusory." Money is apparently exempt, I would say, only until you read closely. But he himself rarely chased that level of object. Instead, he wanted things that normal collectors considered marginal, obscure commentaries, regional printings, battered books that had obviously lived long lives in temples, monasteries, madrasas, anything that combined metaphysics with a sense of being used. Once, when I suggested a pristine copy of a Japanese poetry anthology printed on luxurious mica paper, he shook his head. "Too perfect," he said. "It has never been touched by desperation. I need texts that someone copied because they had to, because they thought the world might end if they did not finish the last page." After about a year of this, I received an invitation. It arrived on thick cream paper in a hand that I recognized as Henryk's, but steadier. "Come to Jokyu," it said, "and see the beginning of the mirage underneath in smaller letters. I also need you to appraise a few purchases. My bankers are getting nervous. It was late autumn when I took the train east. The air smelled of coal and wet leaves. At every station, the names grew more Polish and less German, the roofs lower, the fields wide and dull under a flat sky. A car met me at the station, a mud-spattered Volvo whose driver spoke no German and even less English, but nodded enthusiastically when I said Radecki. We drove through villages where old women sold mushrooms by the roadside under plastic tarps, past stubble fields and small shrines with peeling blue paint. Finally, the road climbed into forest, and the castle appeared. From a distance, it looked like something from a tourist calendar, a long grey facade with two round towers set on a rise above coppiced woods. Up close it was more melancholy. The stone was cracked. One tower wore scaffolding like a broken crown. Henryk was waiting at the entrance, his coat flapping in the wind. Up here, in his own domain, he seemed taller, less fragile. His eyes, however, were the same. "You came," he said, as if he had not been at all sure I would. "I wanted to see whether the legend was true," I said, "and your letter was melodramatic enough to intrigue me." He smiled at that, a quick sideways movement. "You will find that melodrama is the one thing I still possess in abundance. Come." Inside, the castle smelled of dust, old fires, and something else, the faint, dry perfume of paper. He led me not to a grand hall, but to a series of rooms on the second floor, all interconnected, their doors standing open. Each was filled with books. They were everywhere. On shelves, of course, but also on windowsills, stacked in the depths of disused fireplaces, piled on tables and chairs. They rose from the floor in precarious towers, bound with twine or silk cord. The rooms were cold. The radiators clearly hadn't worked in years, but the books made their own warmth. For the first hour, we did nothing but walk. Henryk moved quickly, pointing. "Here, Indian, mostly Sanskrit, some Bengali. I keep the Advaita texts in this room and the tantric material in the next. They argue when placed together." He opened a door. "China and Korea, Buddhist, Confucian, some Taoist. Please don't lean on that wall, it's supporting a set of song commentaries on the Heart Sutra." Another room. Japan, Zen, Shingon, Pure Land. The woodblocks are in cabinets, the smell of the inks attracts silverfish. We passed a narrow passage hung with threadbare carpets. "Here is Iran and Central Asia. Sufi manuals, Shi'i polemics, philosophical texts. Do you see how the scripts differ? You could map metaphysics just from the shapes of the letters." All the while he kept up a running commentary on provenance, binding, marginalia. He knew every volume intimately. Some of the pieces made my breath catch, a group of tightly rolled Pali manuscripts from Sri Lanka wrapped in red cloth, a Japanese folding book of pilgrimage prints, a battered but genuine lithographed Quran printed in Bombay in the 1840s with vernacular glosses in the margins. "How?" I asked finally. "Did you assemble all this?" "I sold things," he said lightly. "Land, timber, a rather stupid horse, eventually paintings. There was a Titian that made the dealer's eyes shine like frogs in a pond. I watched them bid and thought, this canvas will become paper, ink, and dust in another country." It was satisfying. "And your bankers?" "I let them worry. That is what they are paid for." He led me into a smaller room off the main suite. It was almost bare except for a narrow bed, a table, and an armchair facing the window. On the table stood a chipped bowl, an electric kettle, and a stack of small porcelain plates. "This is where you sleep?" I asked. "When I remember to," he said. "More often I sleep in the chair." The bed had no blanket, only a thin grey sheet. On the windowsill lay a crust of bread, one corner bitten off. "I eat little," Henryk said, following my gaze. "Half the time I forget. The less I give the body, the more it leaves me alone to read. You look disapproving." "I sell books for a living," I said. "I have no right to criticize your madness, but I'd prefer my best customer not to die of malnutrition." "I'm not your best customer," he said. "I am your strangest." "That is not mutually exclusive." He laughed, then grew serious. "You asked once what I'm looking for. I think you deserve an answer now that you've seen the evidence." He opened a drawer and took out a folded piece of paper, covered in a tight, angular script. At the center was a diagram, a set of concentric circles labeled in multiple languages: Greek, Sanskrit, Chinese characters, Arabic, Japanese kana. "This," he said, laying it on the table, "is my attempt to map a rumor." Third, the Gnostic rumor. Over dinner, if you could call it that. He ate bread and pickled mushrooms. I had something approximating stew. Henryk laid out his theory. "You know the Gnostics," he began. "Only in the vague Sunday supplement sense," I said. "Demiurge, evil matter, secret knowledge, all that." "Most people think of them as a purely Mediterranean phenomenon," he said. "A weird offshoot of early Christianity. But what if the tradition they drew on was much older and wider? What if their real claim, the idea that this world is a kind of trap, an illusion engineered by a lesser power, was just one expression of a secret that had already passed through Persia, India, and even China?" "You're suggesting a sort of pan-Eurasian conspiracy of pessimists." "Not a conspiracy. A chain of whispers." He stood, restless, and paced the room, gesturing with his spoon. "Consider, in India you have Maya, the veiling power that makes the unreal appear real. In some strands of Buddhism, the entire phenomenal world is compared to a magician's illusion, a reflection in a mirror, a dream. Chinese Huayan metaphysics speaks of the world as a net of mutually reflecting jewels, each illusion containing every other. Persian Sufi poets insist that we walk through a market of shadows while the real city lies elsewhere. And the Gnostics say the world itself is a forgery," I said, "produced by a clumsy artisan god. Yes, I see the family resemblance, but so what? Religions share ideas all the time." Henryk shook his head. "It's not just ideas, it's patterns, phrases, symbols, ways of arranging text on the page. When the Ming court commissioned the Imperial Wisdom Sutras, they used gold ink on indigo paper, with the text surrounded by ornate borders of images. Yet the colophons speak of the world as a false script written across the void." He rummaged through a stack and pulled out a heavy blue-covered volume, its pages shimmering faintly. In some Jain Kalpasutra manuscripts, the cosmological diagrams show a man-shaped universe composed of stacked hells and heavens, each labeled with minute script. Yet small figures at the border hold scrolls that are blank, as if the real words have been erased. He flipped to another example, a Japanese Zen text with koans written in alternate columns of Chinese and Japanese, the same perplexing exchange repeated in two languages, each underlining the other's absurdity. Then you have the Persian poets, Sadi, Rumi, Hafez, playing endlessly with the idea of the page erased, the pen broken, the book of the world closing and scattered among them. Gnostic-like hints. A craftsman God rebuked, a world declared counterfeit. "So you think," I said slowly, "that all these traditions are preserving fragments of some primordial doctrine, that reality is a sort of misprint?" "Yes," he sat down abruptly, "and I am trying to reconstruct the original typesetting." "That's a metaphor too far, even for me." He smiled thinly. "Don't worry, I don't actually think this world is a literal printed book. If that were the case, we could simply cross out the bad parts with a pen. No, my sense, and I admit this may be madness, is that reality behaves like a text. It's full of repetitions, marginalia, interpolations. And like any text, it can be misread or read against itself. And you think your books hold the key to that? I think they are the fingerprints left by previous readers. He pointed at his diagram. The concentric circles were labeled with names: Pleroma, Kanoma, Maya, Samsara, Tianxia, Alam al-Mithal. The outer circle is the world we see, he said. The next is the world described by our first-order myths: creation, fall, salvation. Further in are the philosophical abstractions: emptiness, non-duality, the one. The center is the unnameable source that all these point toward. And where is the demiurge in this picture? He tapped an area between two circles that he had shaded lightly. Here, in the layout itself, the demiurge is whatever force convinces you that only one of these rings is real, that the others are irrelevant or heretical or mere metaphor. The Gnostics recognized the trick but bound it up in their own myth. I am looking for the places where the boundaries blur. I tried to translate this into terms I understood. So you believe that somewhere, in an Indian palm leaf, a Chinese sutra, a Persian commentary, there is a sort of cipher, a set of instructions for reading the world as illusion. Yes, he said, or rather a method for not reading it as the demiurge wants. A way of seeing how flimsy the typesetting really is. And if you find it? He shrugged. Then perhaps I will be able to step outside the story. His tone was light, almost joking, but something in his face, the tightness around the eyes, the slight hollowness in his cheeks, told me he meant it. You are playing a dangerous game, I said. Philosophically, I mean. People who spend their lives convincing themselves that the world is an illusion often end up treating themselves as illusions too. He looked at me for a long moment. Better that than treating illusions as permanent, he said softly. In any case, my body reminds me of its reality frequently enough. As if to prove the point, his stomach growled audibly. He ignored it. For the sales. A year after that visit, the first sale was announced. I saw it not from Henryk, but from an art market newsletter, important castle in eastern Poland to be sold to private foundation. The photographs were unmistakable. The article mentioned a colorful local aristocrat who had decided to sell the ancestral seat to endow a cultural center in Warsaw. I called him at once. Ancestral seat? I said, when he answered breathless. Cultural center? The journalists were offended when I suggested Emergency Metaphysical Research Fund, he replied dryly. Besides, the foundation's board includes 2 bishops and a hedge fund manager. They needed something respectable. You're selling the castle, I said. Where will you live? In the barn, he said matter-of-factly. It's large, dry, and easier to heat. And closer to the road. The movers are already complaining. You're joking. About the movers, yes. About the rest, no. He paused. Do you have that Persian commentary I asked about? The one with marginal notes by that Isfahani mystic? It hasn't surfaced. Keep looking. Once the sale closes, I will be temporarily liquid but permanently homeless. The timing is important. After that, things moved quickly. Money turned to paper, stone turned to silence. The castle was stripped of paintings, furniture, carpets. The books moved first, transported in careful caravans of crates, each labeled in Henryk's hand. He oversaw everything personally, refusing to let the movers touch the most fragile items. I visited once during the transition. The castle echoed like a seashell. In the great hall, outlines of removed paintings haunted the walls. Henryk's bedroom had shrunk to a mattress on the floor, surrounded by stacks of catalogues and auction invoices. He himself had grown thinner. His clothes hung more loosely. His eyes were brighter, but somehow further away. You must eat, I said, as he directed 2 men carrying a crate labeled Japan. Woodblock cones. I eat, he said absently, enough to keep the hands steady. My housekeeper watches me like a hawk. You worry too much about the vessel. Jakob worry about the imprint it carries instead. The imprint would be gone if you collapse. He smiled, but did not answer. In Vienna, I saw his name turning up more and more frequently in auction records. He rarely bought the blockbuster lots, the Ming Sutras, the record-setting Japanese prints like Hokusai's complete 36 views of Mount Fuji, which had just fetched over $3.5 million in New York. Instead, he focused on the obscure lots buried in the catalogues, a group of Iranian devotional booklets printed on cheap paper, a Korean Buddhist commentary miscatalogued as 19th century when it was clearly older, an anonymous Japanese woodblock printed dream diary he bought online by phone through intermediaries. Occasionally, he called me from hotel rooms in London or Hong Kong, his voice buzzing with fatigue and adrenaline. "I lost the sutra," he told me once. "What sutra?" "Sotheby's Hong Kong, a lesser cousin of the Imperial Wisdom set. It went to a museum for a ridiculous price, but they do not know what they have. The cataloguer mentioned a peculiar pattern of tiny circles in the margins around certain phrases. They thought it was merely decorative. Henryk. But the same marks appear in an Iranian Quran I saw in London, which spoke of the world as a shadow on water, and again in a giant manuscript in Zurich circles within circles." His laugh sounded almost giddy. "The demiurge hates circles, Jakob. They remind him of missing the center." "How much did it go for?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. "Enough to buy a village," he said. "Not mine, fortunately. I will live to bid another day." The barn. The real shock came 5 years after my first visit, when I received a letter not from Henryk, but from his lawyer. It was brief and formal. "Our client, Count Henryk Radecki, has instructed us to invite you to Jokiev to appraise his library for estate planning purposes. Accommodation will be provided on site." The date was fixed. There was no question mark at the end. I called Henryk immediately. His phone went straight to voicemail. The recorded message was bafflingly cheerful. "If this is an auction house, leave your lot number. If this is the demiurge, stop calling. Everyone else speak after the tone." The train journey felt longer this time. The stations were the same. The fields, if anything, more forlorn. It was early spring. The snow was retreating in grey, exhausted patches. At the station, a different car met me. An ancient Skoda with a cracked windshield. The driver was an old woman with a kerchief tied tight over her hair. "You are the bookman," she said in Polish-accented German as we lurched away from the platform. "Jakob." "Yes, and you are—" "Sophia. I keep the Count alive." She gave a short, humorless laugh, or tried to. "You work at the castle?" "There is no castle," she said. "Only the barn now." We turned onto a rutted track flanked by bare trees. The castle appeared, distant and pale, but as we approached, we drove past it. The drive curved instead toward a large brick structure half hidden by rows of evergreens. The barn. It had probably once been beautiful in a utilitarian way, with high arched doors and tall windows. Now it looked like a ship run aground. The bricks were patched with mismatched mortar. One corner had been roughly shored up with timber. A thick cable slung from the castle provided electricity. In front of the main doors, snowmelt pooled in muddy puddles. Sophia parked close. "It is easier for him this way," she said. "He says he needs to be near the road in case a courier comes with books. I say he needs to be near a hospital. He does not listen." Inside, the air was a shock. Warm, dry, dense with a smell that was not quite dust, not quite incense. It was book smell raised to the level of climate. The interior had been divided into aisles by freestanding shelves, most of them homemade, planks on bricks, metal uprights bolted together at odd angles. The barn's original beams loomed high above, supporting a roof crisscrossed with cobwebs. Bulbs hung on wires, casting yellow islands of light. And everywhere, as in the castle, were books. But here the arrangement was different. In the castle, the rooms had had distinct themes. In the barn, the categories seemed to swirl and overlap. Sanskrit lay next to Chinese, Japanese next to Persian, as if some invisible magnetic field had drawn them into patterns. "Henryk!" Zofia shouted. Her voice echoed along the aisles. There was no answer. "He is here," she said, not sounding entirely sure. "Somewhere. He does not go out anymore, except in his head." We found him at last near the center of the barn, sitting cross-legged on a thin mat, surrounded by open books. A small electric heater glowed at his back. In front of him, placed with ritual precision, stood a chipped white plate with a slice of bread and a pickled cucumber. He was reading 3 books at once. His right hand held a magnifying glass over a line of tiny Tibetan script. His left finger marked a passage in a Persian treatise. A 3rd book lay across his knees, open to a woodblock illustration of a man waking from a dream. "Henryk," I said softly. He looked up. For a moment his eyes didn't recognize me. Then his expression cleared. "Jakob," he said. His voice sounded not weak, but thin, as if most of its energy had been redirected inward. "You came. Excellent. I need a witness." "A witness to what?" "Whether I have gone too far." Zofia clucked impatiently. "You have gone too far, Pan Hrabia. That is not a question." "I meant metaphysically," he said. To me, he added, "Zofia thinks the only illusions that matter are the ones on the television. She does not understand that the news is merely commentary on a larger hallucination." "I understand you are not eating," she said sharply. "That is enough." Henryk glanced at the plate. "I'm saving it," he said. "For what? The Last Judgment?" She thrust the plate into his hands. "Eat." He sighed and took a mechanical bite of bread. The act seemed to pain him more than any philosophical criticism could have. I sat down on an upturned crate. Up close, I could see how much he had changed. His face was gaunt. The veins on the back of his hands stood out sharply. His hair, once merely unkempt, had become a white halo. Yet his eyes were brighter than I had ever seen them. "I received a letter from your lawyer," I said. "He wants me to appraise your library." Henryk nodded. "He says it is necessary. I have been using the books as collateral for further purchases. My financial situation is now described in their office as novelistic." That doesn't sound like a compliment. "No, but it is accurate." "Are you ill?" I asked bluntly. "Is that why the estate planning?" "In the ordinary sense, probably." He lifted one shoulder. "The doctors say my heart is tired. Personally, I believe it is the world that is tired of my heart. Either way, it does not change the work I have to complete." "And what work is that?" He gestured around us. "You are sitting in it." At first, I thought he meant the general accumulation of books. Then I noticed the floor. Someone, almost certainly Henryk, had drawn faint chalk lines on the cement, dividing the barn into concentric circles like a target. The bookcases were arranged along these rings. In the outermost circle stood works of ritual and popular devotion, prayer books, hymn collections, exorcism manuals. The next circle held exegesis and commentary. The next, pure philosophy. In the innermost ring were a few small tables bearing single volumes, each isolated, spotlighted. "The library is now a map of the rumor," Henryk said. "Outer illusions, inner illusions, commentary, counter-commentary. And here," he tapped the center of his chest, "the reader." I stood, a little shakily, and walked along one of the chalk lines. It was like moving through a planetary system made of paper. In the outer ring, I passed a set of illustrated Hindu devotional booklets printed cheaply in Calcutta, a Japanese book of protective charms, a Persian talismanic scroll. Moving inward, I found more rarefied texts, Upanishadic commentaries, Neo-Confucian treatises, Sufi metaphysical works. The languages and scripts alternated dizzyingly. "What's at the center?" I called. "You'll see," Henryk said. The very center of the barn held only a single table. On it lay 4 books, arranged like the points of a compass. South was a palm leaf manuscript from India, black script marching between red lines. East was a Chinese printed sutra on pale blue paper. North was a Persian manuscript, its headings picked out in gold. West was a Japanese bound book, its pages printed on thin, translucent mulberry paper. Together, they are my best guess, Henryk said quietly, now at my side despite my not having heard him rise. Each is a witness from a different direction. I reached toward the Indian manuscript, then remembered his old rule and stopped. May I? For a moment he hesitated. I saw the old instinct fighting the new need. Then he nodded. But gently. The palm leaf was surprisingly heavy. The script, Devanagari but in an archaic crabbed hand, was dense. The letters bitten into the surface rather than written in the margins. Someone had drawn tiny circles around certain words, like pearls on a string. Those circles again, I said. They mark references to illusion, he said. Wherever the text uses the language of weaving, painting, or writing to describe reality. This manuscript is a version of the Yoga Vasistha, a particularly Baroque Indian text about the world as Dream the commentator, whoever he was, wanted to track every mention of unreality. I put it down and picked up the Chinese sutra. The paper, blue with age, glimmered as if dusted with mica. The characters were meticulous, arranged in vertical columns. At irregular intervals, 3 tiny circles appeared in the margins, connected by a faint line to a phrase in the main text. The Imperial Wisdom Sutras, I guessed. A provincial copy, he said, but based on the same state-sponsored edition. The circles highlight phrases that equate form with emptiness, or speak of the world as a script written and erased by the Buddha. Some scholar 2 centuries ago wanted to make sure the emperor did not miss the subversive parts. Next, the Persian manuscript, an ethical treatise from Safavid Iran, its text surrounded by a gold-ruled frame. Here, too, the margins were punctuated by circles, though these were less precise, more like smudged fingerprints. Possibly by a Sufi reader, Henryk said. Whenever the author slips from moral exhortation into hints that the world is a mere reflection, the reader marks it shadow, mirror, dream. It's all underlined. Finally, the Japanese book. It turned out to be a collection of Zen koans with an 18th century commentary. The same circle marks appeared, this time drawn in faded red ink. Different cultures, different times, Henryk said. Yet some nameless readers all chose the same symbol to flag the same intuition, that the world we see is not the last word. That's suggestive, I admitted, but hardly proof of a secret conspiracy of Gnostics. I told you it's not a conspiracy, he pointed upward toward the dusty rafters. It's condensation. When water evaporates, it forms clouds. When doubt evaporates from religious dogma, it forms heresies. These books are where heresy rained back down onto the page. And what do you plan to do with this condensation? He gave me an oddly shy look. I am almost finished, he said. There is 1 experiment left. 6. The experiment. The appraisal work took 3 days and nights. I moved around the barn with a ledger and a small digital recorder, muttering notes, trying not to let my professional admiration be entirely eclipsed by alarm. Henryk hovered, sometimes helpful, sometimes a distraction. We argued about valuations. I insisted some of his favorite pieces would fetch relatively modest sums compared to their more famous cousins. He insisted that I was missing their metaphysical premium. Collectors pay for fame, I said. Auction houses sell provenance and signatures. They value a Hokusai print or a spectacular Quran because the market recognizes them as masterpieces. And I value the obscure commentary in which a tired monk scribbled his doubt, Henryk replied. The market and I read different catalogues. At night I slept in a small room at the back of the barn that had once stored grain. Zofia brought me blankets and tea and muttered darkly about men who confuse emptiness with holiness. On the second night I woke to the sound of voices. At first I thought Henryk was on the phone, but the tone was wrong. Not the flat, impatient murmur he used with bankers, but something more fervent, curious. I dressed and padded out into the aisles. He was sitting at the center table again, the 4 compass books open before him. A bare bulb swung overhead. He was talking to the books, not reading aloud, but addressing them like old acquaintances. "You all agree on the negation," he was saying in Polish. "This is unreal. That is unreal. But you lack consensus on the exit route. I cannot rely solely on faith. That trick has been tried. I need a method." He picked up the palm leaf and ran a finger along a line. "Here you say, the world is as a painted city in the sky. Fine, but then you immediately drown me in stories, each with its own painted cities. How many illusions must one peel away before reaching the primer?" He turned to the Chinese sutra. "And you, form is emptiness. Emptiness is form. Elegant, yes, but you say nothing about authorship. A text that writes itself is indistinguishable from madness." The Persian manuscript received a gentler rebuke. "You at least know how to laugh," he told it. "You say, we are all drunk in the tavern of appearances and the wine is time. But drunkards rarely find the door." Finally, he addressed the Japanese volume. "Your koans are effective in their way," he said. "They make language trip over its own feet. But your method relies on a teacher who has already stepped outside the story. I am not sure I believe such a creature exists." I cleared my throat. He started, then relaxed when he saw it was me. "Ah, Inspector of Assets. Couldn't sleep. I heard you having a symposium." He smiled faintly. "Every council needs a secretary. Sit." I sat opposite him. The books lay between us like a square altar. "Henryk," I said carefully, "what is this experiment you mentioned?" He traced a finger around the inner edge of the chalk circle. "If the world behaves like a text," he said, "then it might be possible to perform a kind of editorial intervention." "Rewrite reality?" He grimaced. "Such language invites delusion. No, think instead of a misprinted page. If you know where the typo is and what the word should be, you can reconstruct the intended meaning, not perfectly. There may be multiple plausible readings, but you can at least loosen the hold of the error. And the error in this case is the belief that this world is self-sufficient." His eyes gleamed. "That it is all there is. Every one of these texts insists otherwise. They disagree about what lies beyond. Some say a pleroma of light, others an ineffable non-duality, others a pure awareness without object. But they all agree that taking phenomena at face value is a fundamental misreading." "That's hardly news," I said. "Every mystic says the world is illusory." "Yes." He leaned forward. "But what if the illusion is not in the world, but in the reader? What if the demiurge is not a being out there, but a particular habit of attention? A way of reading that freezes the flux into solid objects, separate selves and linear time?" I felt a prickle run down my spine. "You're saying the demiurge is the part of us that insists the story cannot be otherwise?" "Exactly. And if that's true, then the way out is not to destroy the world, but to read it differently, to find a way of attention that refuses the demiurge's punctuation." I glanced at the circled marginal notes. "And these marks are what? Clues left by previous readers who glimpsed that possibility?" He nodded. "They noticed certain phrases, certain metaphors that loosened their habitual reading. In different times and languages, they grabbed the nearest symbol, a circle, a ring, a zero, and said, 'Here, here,' the text bends back on itself. Here, the illusion flickers." "And your experiment?" "Simple," he smiled, and for a moment he looked very young. "I intend to read them all at once." I stared. "That's not simple, that's impossible." "Not in the usual sense," he conceded. "I can't literally read 4 texts simultaneously, but I can orchestrate my attention so that whenever one text makes a move toward unreality, I immediately jump to the corresponding move in another cross-lingual koan, a polyphonic negation." I tried to picture it, his eyes darting among the 4 books, his mind weaving their insights together into some new pattern. The idea was insane. It was also, I had to admit, strangely compelling. "And what do you expect will happen?" I asked. Expectation is the demiurge's twin, he said. I prefer to think in terms of hypotheses. My working hypothesis is that if I can hold enough of these converging negations in mind at once, my usual sense of the world's solidity will crack. Not through drugs, not through extreme fasting, but through a kind of contrapuntal reading. That sounds dangerously like inducing a psychotic break. He spread his hands. Mystical literature and psychopathology have shared a border since the first cave paintings. I am not naive about the risk. But look around you, Jakob. Does this strike you as the life of a man interested in moderation? I had no answer to that. 7. The disappearance. I finished the appraisal on the third day. The numbers were staggering. Even with conservative estimates, the library was worth far more than the castle had been individually. Many items were modest by auction standards, nothing like the record-setting sutras or Qurans that made headlines. But collectively they formed a dense constellation of value, intellectual and monetary. When I handed Henryk the preliminary report, he barely glanced at it. "This will satisfy the lawyers," I said. "It gives them something to attach their lions to." He nodded vaguely. "Thank you. You have been a diligent scribe." "I'm not just a scribe," I said. "I'm your friend. And as your friend, I'm asking you, don't push this too far. You can study these texts for the rest of your life without trying to dissolve yourself into them." He looked genuinely puzzled. "But that is the point of the texts," he said, "to dissolve what I currently take myself to be. Anything less would be an insult to them." "Then at least do it gradually." He smiled. "Have you ever seen someone gradually jump off a cliff?" Zofia drove me back to the station. As we rattled along the muddy road, she gripped the steering wheel with fierce determination. "He talks to the books now," she said without prompting. "Not like before when he argued with them. Now he whispers like they are giving him instructions he forgets to sleep. I find him in the morning sitting in the same place, the same page." "Have you tried taking the books away?" I asked, knowing the answer. She shot me a look of horror. "You do not take a baby from its mother," she said, "even if the baby is made of paper." When I returned to Vienna, the shop felt oddly flat. Customers came and went. I bought a small batch of Japanese prints from a private seller. No hokusai masterpieces, but pleasant landscapes. I followed the news from the auction world, noting the wild prices for a Shahnameh folio here, a Buddhist album there. Occasionally I tried calling Henryk. Sometimes he answered, sometimes he didn't. Our conversations grew shorter, more elliptical. He seemed less interested in specific books and more preoccupied with patterns. "The circles are not marks," he said once, without greeting. "They are tiny windows." "To what?" "To the place where the text realizes it is text." Another time he said, "Do you know why the demiurge hates hunger? Because it reminds the body that it is not self-contained. Hunger is a commentary, not a failure." Then for several months, silence. I told myself he was deep in research, or in some clinic having his heart examined. I told myself Zofia would call if anything serious happened. I told myself many stories. The call came in winter. It was Zofia. Her voice was calm, but I could hear an undertone of strain. "He is gone," she said. My heart lurched. "Gone how?" "Not like you think," she said quickly. "He did not die, at least, I do not know. He has disappeared." "Start from the beginning," I said. 3 nights earlier, she told me, Henryk had kept to his usual schedule, reading late into the night in the barn while she slept in the small room at the back. Sometime around dawn, she woke to an odd silence. "Normally he mutters," she said, "or I hear him turning pages. That morning there was nothing, so I went to look. The light above his table was still on. The 4 books were open, but he was not there." "You searched?" "Everywhere. In the barn, the castle, the grounds. No footprints in the snow, nothing." "What about his coat, his shoes?" "All there. The only thing missing is his watch." "His watch? It belonged to his grandfather. He always wore it when he went into town. I found it later in his room on the table." "Perhaps he went for a walk and fell." In the sky, she interrupted. There are no tracks, no broken branches, no disturbance in the snow, as if he stood up from the chair and stepped into another room that does not exist. Her voice shook on the last word. I heard her take a breath. The police say he could have planned this, that he left in the night, got into a car arranged with someone, changed clothes. But why? His passport is still here. His money. Only the watch is moved. I didn't know what to say. Every plausible explanation, suicide, abduction, some carefully orchestrated disappearance, ran aground on the simple physical facts she reported. I'm coming, I said. 8. The secret. Snow lay deeper now along the road to Jokyu. The castle loomed in the distance like a memory. The barn squatted under its white cap of roof, the cable from the castle stark against the sky. Inside, the air was cold but dry. Someone had turned down the heaters. Zofia met me at the door, wrapped in a thick coat. Her eyes were red, whether from crying or from the cold I could not tell. Everything is as it was, she said. The polizia have gone. They poked around like blind moles and left. We walked together down the central aisle. The chalk circles were faint but still visible. At the center table, the 4 books lay open, their pages unmoved. The electric bulb overhead had burned out. I replaced it with one from a nearby fixture. Light flooded the scene. Don't touch anything, she said. I need to, I replied. Not for the police, for myself. She hesitated, then nodded and retreated to the edge of the inner circle, as if afraid to come closer. I examined the chair first. It was an ordinary folding wooden chair, slightly worn where his hands had gripped the arms. There were no scorch marks, no signs of sudden combustion. The floor beneath it was bare cement, dusty but undisturbed. The books told a different story. On the palm leaf manuscript, several of the marginal circles had been joined by faint pencil lines, forming a sort of constellation. On the Chinese sutra, Henryk had underlined a passage with a light, trembling hand. I recognized the phrase from his earlier remarks, a line about the world as a script that writes itself. On the Persian text, he had added in the margin a single word, khalq, creation, followed by a question mark and what looked like a tiny spiral. In the Japanese volume, the ink of some characters was slightly smeared, as if traced by a fingertip. The koan on that page described a monk who dreams he is a butterfly and wakes unsure whether he is a man who dreamed or a butterfly dreaming now. I stood back and tried to see what he had been seeing. The 4 texts formed a square, each with its own set of circled phrases and marginal marks. If I squinted, the pattern of circles seemed almost to align across the books, as if someone had tried to draw a circle through all 4 at once. The effect was dizzying, like looking at a stereogram. You see something, Zofia said softly. Maybe, I said, or I'm projecting. Projecting what? His madness. She laughed, a small sound. He called it research. On impulse, I sat in his chair. The perspective shifted. From here, the 4 books filled my field of vision in a way they hadn't when I stood. I could see the circled phrases without moving my head much. The chalk circles on the floor framed the table like ripples around a stone. I tried to imagine Henryk sitting here for hours, days, weeks, his hunger, his fatigue, his fanatic focus. What if he did it? A treacherous part of my mind whispered. What if he read himself out of the story? I forced myself to think more soberly. There were mundane possibilities. Perhaps he had planned an escape, stashed a change of clothes somewhere, arranged for someone to pick him up on the road. The lack of tracks could be explained by timing and weather, snowdrifting, wind covering traces. The missing watch might be symbolic, a deliberate break with his past. And yet, I reached for the Indian manuscript, then stopped halfway. My hand was trembling. I shouldn't, I said. Why not? Zofia asked. Because I might start where he left off. She looked at me for a long moment. He trusted you, she said. If there is any message, you are the one who should read it. Not the bankers, not the polizia. Her logic was absurd, but it resonated. Very gently, I lifted the palm leaf. The page before me was a dense jungle of script, but Henryk's circles stood out like small moons. I followed the pencil lines connecting them, then raised my eyes to the corresponding phrases in the other books. Indian, the world is like a painted city in the sky. Chinese, form is emptiness, emptiness is form. Persian, we walk through a bazaar of shadows. The real city lies unseen. Japanese, not knowing he was dreaming, he pitied the dream. From any one of these, the conclusion was familiar. The world is illusory. Look beyond. Having spent years surrounded by such texts, I had inoculated myself against them. But taken together, something subtler emerged. It was not the blunt assertion, the world is false. It was a question about where the falsity resided. Painted cities, empty forms, shadow bazaars, dreaming butterflies, they all pointed not to the destruction of the world, but to the unreliability of perception, the slipperiness of the line between appearance and interpretation. The illusion was not in the objects, but in how they were strung together into a story. I remembered Henryk's phrase, "The demiurge is a habit of attention." A sudden dizziness washed over me. The lines of text seemed to swim, the circles blurred into a ring. For a moment, I had the uncanny sense that the 4 books were copies of a single book seen from different angles, like mirrors reflecting each other. "Jakob," Sophia's voice came from far away. "Are you all right?" I closed my eyes. The dizziness subsided. "I'm fine," I said. "Just tired." "Like him," she murmured. I put the manuscript down carefully and stood. The barn creaked around us. Somewhere a mouse scurried. A distant drip echoed. "What will you do now?" I asked. "Look after the books," she said simply, "until the lawyers decide to sell them. They will come with their catalogues and their little stickers and take everything away in boxes. It will be like watching him die again in slow motion." "You could fight it." "With what? Sentiment?" She shook her head. "He borrowed too much. They have papers. Papers beat memories." She walked me to the door. Outside, the snow reflected the grey sky. "You think he killed himself," she said quietly. "I don't know what I think," I said. "I think—" She hesitated. "Sometimes at night I hear pages turning, very softly, as if someone is still reading." 9. The surprise. Months passed, the legal machinery ground on. Henryk remained officially missing. The police leaned toward the theory that he had staged his own disappearance to avoid debt. The newspapers, briefly intrigued by the vanishing count, moved on to fresher sensations. In Vienna, life resumed its patterns. I bought and sold books. I drank coffee. I read auction catalogues with a more jaundiced eye. Occasionally I dreamed of the barn, not as it was, but as a kind of cathedral whose pillars were stacks of books, whose stained glass windows were pages held up to the light. Then, one day, a package arrived. It was small and heavy, wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. No return address, only my name and shop, written in an unfamiliar hand. The postmark was from a town near Zholkiev. I opened it carefully. Inside lay Henryk's watch. It was an old pocket watch, silver, slightly dented. Attached to it by a loop of thread was a folded piece of paper. On the outside, in Henryk's spidery hand, was written, "For Jakob, in case of successful editing." My throat constricted. I unfolded the paper. The note was brief. "My friend, if you are reading this, it seems I have managed some sort of exit. Whether from debt, delusion, or the world itself, I cannot say. Perhaps all 3 amount to the same move in different commentaries. Do not waste time looking for my body. If it is still around, I trust Sophia and the worms to treat it kindly. You, however, must decide whether to follow my example or to serve as a warning against it. Enclosed is my grandfather's watch. I have no further use for time. I suggest you sell it and buy a book you do not understand. Read it until you begin to suspect that it is reading you. As for the secret I sought, I leave you with a koan of my own manufacture. If this world is a mirage, who is the thirsty man? With affection, H." I read the note 3 times. Each time the last line hit me differently, now as madness, now as play, now as a genuine question. I turned the watch over. On the back, someone, probably his grandfather, had engraved a short phrase in Latin, non horum sed usum, not the hour but the use. I laughed aloud, an odd, strangled sound, half grief, half delight. Later that week, I discovered something stranger. I was reorganizing a shelf in the shop when a slim Japanese woodblock printed volume fell out from behind a row of catalogues. It was a text I didn't remember acquiring, a collection of Zen anecdotes printed in Edo with marginalia in a neat, anonymous hand. On several pages, small circles had been drawn around certain phrases. Bemused, I checked my ledger. No record of purchase, no consignor's note. The book had simply appeared. I opened it at random. My eye fell on a passage. A monk asked the master, "What is the world?" The master said, "A mistake in the mind of a tired copyist." The monk asked, "And what is enlightenment?" The master said, "Noticing the ink on your fingers." A chill ran through me. I turned the page. In the margin beside another story, someone had written in English very faintly, "Check your hands, Jakob." I stared at the words. The handwriting was not quite Henryk's, but it bore a family resemblance, as if written by a cousin who shared his nervous energy. Instinctively, I looked at my fingers. They were smudged with grayish dust from the shelves, the residue of decades of handling old paper. I began to laugh again, but this time the laughter felt oddly light, almost buoyant, as if it came from somewhere just behind my chest. Was the book a prank? Had Henryk planted it in my shop during an earlier visit, trusting that I would find it only after he was gone? Or had Sophia sent it along with the watch, though there was no sign of postal handling? Or, and this possibility, while absurd, refused to quite leave, I was now living in a story whose author had a sense of humor. I sold the watch eventually. Not for a fortune, but enough to buy a book I did not understand. A dense Sanskrit treatise on logic, whose diagrams and syllogisms looked like the tracks of some careful insect. I read it at night, blinking under the lamp, my fingers smudged with ink and dust. Sometimes, when I close the shop and the city noise falls away, I imagine I can hear pages turning in the silence, very softly, as if someone in a distant barn were still reading. On those nights, I do not ask whether the world is a mirage. I ask instead a question I learned from a mad count who loved books more than comfort. If this story is an illusion, what am I doing with my hands? And then, because there is nothing else to do, I turn the page.